It's Friday, November the 25th, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of parliamentary highlights. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh and Cardiff, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent, Sean Curran. On the programme this week...
The Scottish Parliament does not have the power to legislate for a referendum on Scottish independence.
After this ruling from the UK Supreme Court, Scotland's First Minister expresses her disappointment.
This judgment raises profound and deeply uncomfortable questions about the basis and the future of the United Kingdom.
The Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition clash at PMQs.
Britain faces the lowest growth of any OECD nation over the next 2 years. Why?
If the Labour Party is serious about actually supporting growth, maybe they should get on the phone with their union paymasters and tell them to call off the strike.
The Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, admits the government has failed to control the UK's borders, but says others are to blame.
It's very clear who's at fault. It's the people who are breaking our rules, coming here illegally, exploiting vulnerable people and trying to abuse the generosity of the British people. That's who's at fault.
Veterans who took part in the UK's nuclear testing programme will receive a new medal after years of campaigning in recognition of their service.
From one veterans campaigner to another, I salute you. I salute your relentlessness, I salute your courage, and I salute your determination.
Let's start here at Westminster with our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. Sean, the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, delivered his autumn statement last Thursday, and this week began with a two-day debate on the measures announced in that statement. What happened?
Yeah, the autumn statement was a big political event, but it wasn't quite a budget. After we've got a budget, we normally have several days of debate, but this year there were 2 days of debate after this autumn statement. At the weekend, there had been a lot of talk that these would be a difficult couple of days for the government and for the Chancellor, because perhaps some Conservative MPs who were unhappy at the general tone of the statement would complain. In the end, it passed off pretty smoothly, although, of course, there was criticism, but it mainly came from the opposition parties.
We want to be honest with the public about the challenge and fair in our solutions. So what does that mean? It means a focus on stability, growth and public services. Mr Deputy Speaker, to provide a shelter for those most at risk from the economic winds, we are rating pensions and benefits in line with inflation next year based on September's figure of 10.1%.
Let it be clear, never again can Conservative politicians at election time stand in front of posters of double whammy boxing gloves or tax bombshells, because the tax on working people, combined with the wages that people are losing to the ravages of inflation, means that working people are being squeezed until the pips squeak under this Conservative government.
There is obviously a very important debate, I think, to be had about the willingness of our financial institutions to conduct dynamic modelling of the impact of both economic reform, supply-side economic reform, but also lower taxes on economic growth. But noting that we are where we are, it would clearly have been better for that statement to have been accompanied by a full spending review.
If that mini-budget was so disastrous and ill thought through, why did he support it?
It's precisely because I don't believe it was disastrous and ill thought through. I believe very firmly in the merits of a lower tax, higher growth economy.
We can see clearly why the Brexit anti-dividend is biting so hard. It has brought increased trade frictions with our closest trading partners, and it has closed off what was previously a plentiful supply of skilled labour, which brought nothing but benefit to our country and to our economy.
I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, the question we have to ask ourselves is, why is it that our economy is failing so badly that so many people are unable to obtain, through their work, and other efforts the means to sustain the absolute basics of living for themselves and for their families.
We do not help the weak by pulling down the strong. We help the disadvantaged more by enabling the talented, privileged and successful to thrive, to start more businesses, pay more salaries to their employees, put more tax into the exchequer and earn more profits.
We do have a massive problem in this country with more and more people choosing not to work. And we have to ask ourselves that if benefits are increasing with inflation, which is very high, while public sector pay is being kept down, that is a disincentive to work. And many people who are striving, working very hard, perhaps in low-paid jobs, they wonder why their pay is being kept down, while those on benefit who could work see their benefits rising with inflation.
That was a flavour of the debate that followed the autumn statement the following week, of course. But on Wednesday, the Chancellor himself was questioned by the Treasury Select Committee.
Yes, and that's when Jeremy Hunt made those headline-grabbing comments saying that people should save energy so that the UK wouldn't be, as he put it, blackmailed by Vladimir Putin. So those headline that got the headline, if you like, but most of the session, as you would expect, and it did go on for quite a long time, was about the detail of what he had announced in the autumn statement. And this was an opportunity for the MPs to try to pick apart and also challenge the Chancellor about some of the measures he announced last week.
I've searched high and low through your statement, but I can't seem to find the section on those with the broadest shoulders of all, the non-DOMs. How much would closing the tax loophole for the super-rich raise for the public purse?
I want to make sure that wealthy foreigners pay as much tax in this country as possible. Ireland has a non-DOM regime. France has a non-DOM regime. These are people who are highly mobile, and I want to make sure that we don't do anything that inadvertently loses us more money than we raise.
When it comes to the super-rich, we always want to give concessions, whether it's the non-DOM tax loophole, whether it's charitable status for private schools, whether it's the lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses. So incentives for the rich and responsibility for the police sergeant, the senior ward sister, or the school head of year, who will be brought into higher tax bands through your frozen thresholds. Isn't it the case there's one rule for the rich and another rule for everybody else?
No. We increased taxes on the wealthiest. When it came to the poorest people, you can see we uprated benefits by inflation. That's an £11 billion commitment. We respected the triple lock, which reaches a lot of pensioners on low incomes. We have a very generous energy price guarantee, about £900 per household, £500 next year.
One of the things that the OBR makes very clear is that the affordability of all of this depends very much on what actually happens to energy prices. And they've suggested that this particular scheme in a scenario could cost another 71 billion, and they give a scenario in terms of where energy prices might land up. If that happens, do you still stand by the guarantee and the scheme, the specific support scheme you've put in place, to the deadline that you currently set, so people aren't concerned as to what might happen if energy prices go up during the next couple of years?
You're absolutely right to point to the high cost. It's probably going to cost around 80 billion this year, and possibly around half that next year. And we do stand behind what we've offered. We think it's very important that we give people security, that what we've promised we will deliver. But in the long run, we're going to need everyone to help us crack this problem. And so what we're really saying is that we will always be there to help poorer households. The way we do it will change, and that's why we talk about a social tariff or a social discount. But for most people, we need you to play your part in reducing our energy dependency on what Putin chooses to do in Ukraine, and that's why we've got this national ambition to reduce energy consumption by 15%. The EU ambition is 13%. We're a couple of percent higher, but Other countries are doing the same kind of thing. And that isn't just at a national level, but that's for every household. And we think that the £500 that we're offering to help people save next year at current gas prices, if people did the 15%, they could save that £500 themselves in the amount they pay in the years that follow. So we're trying to help people to help themselves. We're giving them a cushion this year and next, but we do need people to change their behaviour.
This year alone, your party has given us 3 prime ministers, 4 chancellors, 4 different versions of a Conservative government and 6 fiscal events. 147 members of the government, including 32 cabinet ministers, have resigned or been sacked. What effect do you think this chaos has had on our economic prospects and our international reputation?
Well, I wish we hadn't had that level of instability, but I produced an autumn statement that is designed to restore economic stability and consistency of economic policy making, and I hope we can turn the page on all that instability. The primary cause for the economic challenges we face are the 2 big shocks of a pandemic and an energy crisis. That's what other countries are facing as well. There are, Germany, Holland, Italy has higher inflation than we have. So I think it's wrong to say that this is somehow a uniquely UK issue in terms of the economic instability.
I think everyone accepts that there are economic shocks around, but doesn't that mean it's an even more silly time to be as self-indulgent as we've seen in governance your party deliver at that crucial time when there are these shocks?
Well, as I say, I wish we hadn't had that instability, but I think it's wrong to say that the economic issues that we're dealing with are primarily as a result of that. If you look at this year, and I've just counselled against taking 1-year snapshots, but you just talked about all the instability we've had in 1 year. That happens to be the year where we've got the fastest growth in the G7, so that's why I would hesitate to draw too many comparisons.
Right, so you're possibly arguing that we should do this every year as a growth.
You'll be pleased to know I'm not arguing that.
Well, that's a relief. And the economy was a theme that continued into Prime Minister's questions on Wednesday, that clash between Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak.
Yes, new figures came out this week and Sir Keir Starmer seized on them. This, of course, was the 4th time the two men had met, because they had a week off last week because it was Angela Rayner and Dominic Raab. And there was a slight change of tone. They dropped what had become rather familiar attack lines where they were just repeating the same arguments which they'd done the previous 3 times. And Sir Keir Starmer seized on these new figures from the OECD, an international think tank that had been talking about growth. And so he wanted to press the Prime Minister on those latest statistics.
Britain faces the lowest growth of any OECD nation over the next 2 years. Why?
Mr. Speaker, this country has experienced since 2010 the 3rd highest growth in the G7. This year, the fastest growth in the G7, and unemployment at a multi-decade low. We're getting on to deliver more growth, Mr. Speaker. We're delivering free ports. We're investing in apprenticeships. We're protecting R&D. And if the Labour Party is serious about actually supporting growth, maybe they should get on the phone with their union paymasters and tell them to call off the strikes.
He's in total denial. We're bottom of the 38 OECD countries who are all in the same boat when it comes to COVID and Ukraine. And he wants a pat on the back. It's like a football manager, bottom of the league at Christmas, celebrating an away draw 3 months ago, and it won't wash. So they don't like their record, that's the problem. So let's try it another way. Why is Britain set to be the first country into recession and the last country out?
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased that the Right Honourable Gentleman brought up the OECD report, because it contained actually 3 very important points. Firstly, it made the point that actually in the years following the pandemic, we're projected to have almost the highest growth amongst our peer countries. It also made the point, it was crystal clear that the challenges we face are completely international in nature. And thirdly, Mr. Speaker, it supported our fiscal plan because it's credible and ensures sustainability. Now, the right honourable gentleman would have known all of that if he actually read the whole report. But he's not interested in substance. He's an opportunist, Mr. Speaker.
Because of the changes he's made, a typical household will end up paying tax increases of £1,400. Contrast that to a super wealthy non-dom living here but holding their income overseas. How much more has he asked them to pay?
Labour had 13 years to address this issue and did nothing. It was the Conservative government that took action and tightened the rules. But the problem with his idea is that it would end up costing Britain money. Not my words, the words of the former Labour Shadow Chancellor.
This morning, the Supreme Court clarified a point of law, but the very point of democracy in this union is now at stake, and democracy will not be denied. Because whether Westminster likes it or not, last year the people of Scotland voted for a Scottish Parliament with a majority and the mandate to deliver an independence referendum. The Prime Minister has every right to oppose independence. He has no right to deny democracy to the people of Scotland. If the Prime Minister keeps blocking that referendum, will he at least be honest and confirm that the very idea that the United Kingdom is a voluntary union of nations is now dead and buried?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me start by saying we respect the clear and definitive ruling of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. And what I would say to the honourable gentleman, that firstly, I am looking forward to also seeing the moderator of Scotland tomorrow. And I think that the people of Scotland want us to be working on fixing the major challenges that we collectively face, whether that's the economy, supporting the NHS, or indeed supporting Ukraine. Now is the time for politicians to work together, and that's what this government will do.
Sean, we heard and saw there the SNP leader in Westminster, Ian Blackford, on that Supreme Court ruling. It was a big day, of course. He wasn't the only SNP MP who spoke at Prime Minister's questions, perhaps unsurprisingly, on the ruling, was he?
He wasn't. And in fact, as the questions went on and we moved away from the main exchanges with the party leaders, really the question time was dominated by those exchanges between the SNP and Rishi Sunak. And this is literally the luck of the draw. Every week there's an order paper. It lists the name of 14 MPs who get to ask a question of the Prime Minister. Now, because dozens of MPs want to ask a question every week, their names are sort of put into, not a hat, a computer programme, and there's a kind of a raffle. In Westminster they call it the shuffle, and this produces the names and the order in which they'll speak. And as luck would have it, 6 out of the 14 names yesterday were SNP members. And so that then meant that there was a kind of a coordinated push on Rishi Sunak because, of course, they all asked about that Supreme Court decision.
Oh, right. So it really was the luck of the draw.
Yes. I mean, obviously, like any sort of raffle or lottery, you have to be in it to win it. So if lots of SNP members, knowing this crucial day was in the diary and they knew this decision was coming, if they all put in, they're obviously going to have a much better chance of being selected.
Well, thanks for that, Sean. We'll be back with you a little later on. Now, let's continue on the theme of the Supreme Court decision and find out the reaction in Scotland. Let's go to Edinburgh and talk to our Scotland political reporter, Jenny Davidson. Hello, Jenny. That judgment and the Scottish Parliament now knows it doesn't have the power. It's been reiterated again to hold another independence referendum has been the big story in Scotland. What has been the reaction?
Well, indeed, a very significant judgment from the Supreme Court. Now, Nicola Sturgeon, of course, would prefer to get the agreement of the UK government anyway. This was kind of plan B to begin with. But clear from the Prime Minister's reaction there that that's not likely to be forthcoming. The reaction and the view of both Rishi Sunak, of Keir Starmer and indeed of Unionist parties here at Holyrood is really this isn't a priority at the moment, and we should be focusing on the cost of living crisis and move on from this. But in a press conference following the Supreme Court judgment, Nicola Sturgeon, while she welcomed the clarity on the issue, she said she was disappointed. She said it was a hard pill to swallow, and she also questioned how this could be a voluntary partnership of nations if there wasn't really a way for Scotland to leave, as did the Constitution Secretary Angus Robertson in Parliament later.
No matter how the people of Scotland vote, or how often they elect parliaments that support a referendum or support independence, they cannot be told no by the UK Prime Minister. This cannot be right, and there are few stronger or more powerful arguments for independence than that. In a voluntary union, one part doesn't have to rely on the agreement of another before it is allowed to even think about leaving.
Given the cost of this case, in taxpayers' money and time, I do think it's regrettable that the First Minister herself was unable to come to this chamber to answer. She was more than happy this morning to comment from behind an SNP podium as SNP leader, but she is now unwilling to answer questions today in this chamber from elected Scottish parliamentarians as First Minister. The Scottish people have made it clear in poll after poll that they do not want another referendum next year.
Members.
So I welcome.
Members.
So I do welcome the Supreme Court's clear and unanimous judgment, and it is one that we all must respect, and I hope the SNP backbenchers here do as well. But we now have an opportunity, Cabinet Secretary, to focus on the big challenges Scotland faces right now. Strikes, the global cost of living crisis and a winter storm in our NHS.
And following that Supreme Court judgment, the First Minister's announced that she's going to go with her backup option, which is to use the next general election as a sort of de facto referendum on independence, with the details of this to be worked out by the SNP in the new year. But of course, a lot of challenges around that. A general election has many different issues going on. Reaching the threshold of whatever they decide is necessary to prove a vote for independence could be a challenge. And of course, there's a question of whether that would be recognised as an independence referendum at all.
Yes, indeed. I mean, on another subject, Jenny, this week teachers have gone on strike over pay, haven't they?
That's right. Scotland's biggest teaching union, the EIS, held a one-day strike yesterday, the first time since the 1980s there's been a national teachers' strike. Now, earlier in the week, there seemed to be some hope that there might be a new pay deal on the table, enough to call off the strike. The teachers had already rejected a 5% offer back in September. They're looking for 10. They've rejected that new pay deal that was offered this week, with EIS General Secretary Andrea Bradley calling it an abject insult. But there's disagreement really about who's responsible for the lack of money to fund these pay offers.
Teachers have been let down by an SNP government that has been too slow to come to the table and take decisive action to resolve the pay disputes. Pupils and parents have been let down by an SNP government that says education is their top priority but cannot even keep the schools open. Will the Cabinet Secretary take the opportunity now to apologise to parents and pupils for this stramash of her making?
I do have to be frank with Mr Kerr. The United Kingdom Government made clear in the autumn statement that there is no additional support for public sector pay, not one penny. So I'm afraid the 10% pay claim that is coming from the teacher unions is unaffordable to the Scottish Government. Any extra money for pay deals will have to be found elsewhere within an already contained Scottish Government budget. So the fault that the place that we are in lies absolutely with the UK Government and the mess that they have driven to the UK economy and to the levels of inflation.
Thank you, members.
That is the reality of the situation that we are in.
And if this isn't resolved, there's another couple of days strike planned for January, as well as a different teaching union planning to strike in December. And of course, this is just one of a number of strikes that are going on over the next few weeks. We've got rail, we've got postal workers, university lecturers, ambulance staff, a possible nurses strike. And just with this, the inflation, there's this conflict now between what people feel is a reasonable pay offer in order to make ends meet and what governments are able to afford.
There have also been questions, Jenny, this week about the future of the NHS in Scotland. What was discussed?
Well, indeed, this relates to minutes of a meeting of senior NHS leaders. The BBC saw those minutes, and it was about discussion about, some quite profound possible changes. Blue Sky thinking about possible changes to the NHS in future. There was a number of issues, possibly just discharging people earlier, pausing the funding of some new drugs, changes to GP services, and talk about a £1 billion hole, and saying it was not possible to continue with programmes while still remaining safe. But perhaps the one that's most caught people's attention was the suggestion that there could be some kind of two-tier system within the NHS where people who can afford to would pay to go privately, and those who couldn't would continue to receive free healthcare on the NHS. Now, the Scottish Government is absolutely adamant. It has denied that there's any possibility of changing the principles of the NHS.
It's the founding principle of our National Health Service as a universal service, free at the point of use, publicly funded and publicly delivered for all. They are not up for debate nor indeed discussion. From abolishing prescription charges to removing dental charges for young people, this government has a laudable track record in dismantling any financial barriers that continue to exist in our National Health Service. Let me repeat, while reform undoubtedly is necessary in the face of a global pandemic, that reform will never ever be in contradiction of the founding principles of our NHS.
If you need an operation, a knee or a hip operation, and you can afford that, then you will get it. If you have savings and you can pay for it, you will get an operation. And if you are able to borrow the money to pay for it, then you will get an operation. But for those who can do none of these, they suffer in pain on long waiting lists. I reiterate, we are already falling into a two-tier health system.
Well, as you heard there, that question about whether there should be a two-tier system with the NHS has kind of led on to further questions of whether there already is one. With so many pressures now on demand and the backlog and people on waiting lists, and the difficulty of having people treated within targets. It's that question of how do you treat everyone within the parameters of the NHS as it stands at the moment?
Yes, Jenny, those pressures on the NHS will continue. Jenny Davidson there at Holyrood, thank you very much. Let's return to Westminster, our correspondent Sean Curran. Sean, there were a number of Cabinet Secretaries who were before select committees for questioning this week. Amongst them was the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who faced questions on various topics, including the asylum process. What did she say?
Yes, she appeared alongside senior officials from her department, and as we heard in the headlines, she was quick to criticise people smugglers and people who broke the rules, as she had put it. And this was all in the context of her admitting that the UK government had not got control of its borders. And she conceded that her department needed to be more efficient, but she was very quick to point the finger of blame at people smugglers and others who broke the rules.
When did you first become aware that there was this crisis developing at Manston, and when were you told that you were potentially in breach of the law by holding people?
Whenever I've been provided with legal advice by officials, I've always taken it into account, read it, listened to it when it's been delivered to me orally, and borne it in mind when decisions have to be made.
How did the Home Office get itself into this mess with up to 4,000 people being detained at Manston? Who, as Home Secretary, obviously you carry the can for this, so is it your responsibility? Is it a previous Home Secretary? Is it Grant Shapps for his short tenure as Home Secretary? Whose fault is it that we had this crisis?
I'll tell you who's at fault.
Yeah.
It's very clear who's at fault. It's the people who are breaking our rules, coming here illegally, exploiting vulnerable people, and trying to abuse the generosity of the British people. That's who's at fault.
Just a bit of role play. I'm a 16-year-old orphan from an East African country escaping a war zone and religious persecution. And I have a sibling legally in the United Kingdom at the moment. What is a safe and legal route for me to come to the United Kingdom?
Well, we have an asylum system, and people can put in applications for asylum.
How would I do that?
Well, you can do it through the safe and legal routes that we have. We have offered 390,000 places to people seeking safety from various countries around the world.
I'm not Syrian, I'm not Afghan, I'm not Ukrainian, not any of those specific schemes. The Dub scheme is historic. What scheme's open to me?
Well, if you are able to get to the UK, you are able to put in an application for asylum.
But I would only enter the UK illegally then, wouldn't I?
Well, that would, if you put in your application for asylum upon arrival, that would be the process that you enter.
How could I arrive in the UK if I didn't have permission to get onto an aircraft legally to arrive in the UK?
Let me just invite other colleagues if there's anything they want to add.
I mean, you could engage with UNHCR. I mean, depending which country you're from, you could engage with UNHCR, and that would be a way of getting leave to enter the UK in order to put in an asylum claim. But I accept that there are some countries where that would not be possible.
I know they're making spurious claims, and you know, and most people in the real world know they're making spurious claims. What can we do? Because an immigration law is never going to admit it. A claimant's never going to admit it. So how do we solve that problem?
Well, we did announce earlier that we are going to introduce legislative measures. I can't go into the detail of what that legislation is going to include because discussions are still live within government. But there is a need to make the rules more robust and the regime tighter. And whether that's effectively, we want to send the message that if you are coming here illegally, you will not be able to stay here indefinitely in some cases or for a very long period of time while your asylum claim is being processed.
So that was Suella Braverman, because there was also an urgent question about the selection of hotels for asylum accommodation, which has been deemed to be extremely expensive, with the Immigration Minister, Robert Jenrick, responding for the government. He didn't have an easy time, did he?
No, he didn't. This is a very controversial issue. A lot of MPs are very unhappy about hotels in their constituencies being used to house asylum seekers. This urgent question was on the point of whether or not local councils were being consulted before people were housed in hotels. And during those exchanges, one Conservative MP, Philip Hollowbone, called on Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister, to resign. It doesn't get much worse than that for a minister.
Thank you very much, Sean. More from you later on. Let's go to Cardiff and to our Wales political correspondent, Daniel Davis. Daniel, let's start with football. First Minister Mark Drakeford wasn't in the Senate this week because he was at the World Cup. But he's been under a lot of pressure, hasn't he, over his decision to go to Qatar?
Well, there's been an awful lot of debate about whether Welsh ministers should stay away from Qatar in protest at that country's record on human rights and workers' rights, but they have gone. And while Mark Drakeford was there, the business minister, or Trefnydd Leslie Griffiths, deputised for him, and she said that FIFA had committed an outrageous last-minute decision by announcing that players would be booked if they wore the One Love armband, which Gareth Bale, the Welsh captain, had intended to do. Now, despite the controversy, the World Cup, the first World Cup for Wales since 1958, has brought a lot of attention to the Welsh football team and their song for the tournament, Yma o Hyd. And the Plaid Cymru MS, Delyth Jewell, wanted to know how the Welsh Government would capitalise on that publicity.
I'm proud that the Cymru team have been so open in sharing Wales's values with the world. But the government here must help ensure that the World Cup's legacy in Wales is a positive one. So I'd like a statement, please, outlining how that will happen. How can we build on the phenomenal success of Yma o Hyd in opening up access and engagement with Cymraeg? How can our sporting success translate into the grassroots game? And how can we ensure that Wales becomes an even more unashamedly inclusive, equal nation and loudly proud of being so after this tournament.
We discussed in First Minister's questions, the outrageous last-minute U-turn by FIFA in relation to the One Love armband. But I think it is a massive opportunity for us, and that's why, as a government, the First Minister is currently on his way back from Qatar, where I know he's had a series of meetings in relation to what we can do from a Welsh government to encourage businesses to come here, for instance.
Initially, the Welsh Government were going to send 3 ministers to the World Cup finals. Eventually, they reduced that to 2. But even with the tournament well underway, they're still facing questions about whether that was the appropriate thing to do.
On a completely different topic, Daniel, Gwent Police is under the spotlight because of an investigation into a former officer accused of corruption, misogyny, racism and homophobia. What have politicians been saying about it?
Well, this follows revelations about an officer called Ricky Jones. After he died, his family discovered offensive messages on his phone that had been shared with serving and retired officers in the Gwent police force. Now, this has become a huge topic of concern for politicians in the Gwent area, in the southeast of Wales. The officer's family has said that they have misgivings about the way that the Gwent force has responded to these revelations. And the leader of the Welsh Conservatives here in the Senedd said this week that he has similar concerns.
How on earth, with such accusations that are being put forward, real accusations that say exactly how it is, that people are petrified to go to individuals to seek help, can those 33 women, leave alone the rest of the community in the Gwent area, seek that assurance? So I have said I have no confidence in the ability of the senior management at Gwent Police to rectify this situation. I asked you in the first question, do you have confidence?
We do have confidence. As I say, the Minister for Social Justice has met with both the Chief Constable and the PCC to discuss the concerns. As far as I know, she hasn't had a further meeting. You mentioned comments that the family had come forward with. And it's really important that obviously people who do want to come forward with their concerns, if they have been a victim of any crime, that they do have confidence in the police force. And that's why it's so important that that these allegations were dealt with immediately, which was certainly the case.
Now, Andrew Davies has written to Suella Braverman saying that the Gwent force should be put into special measures. The Home Office says that could only happen on the basis of a recommendation by the Inspectorate. In the meantime, the Chief Constable of Gwent has promised robust and swift action. She's having regular meetings with MPs and Senedd members in the region. A number of referrals have been made to the complaints procedure, and there is an investigation underway being handled by Wiltshire Police.
We heard earlier, Daniel, about the Supreme Court decision on the Scottish independence referendum. No doubt that verdict was being watched very closely in Cardiff too.
It was. The Welsh Government's top law officer, Labour's Mick Antoniv, said that they were keeping a watching brief on the case. So too Plaid Cymru, who, like their nationalist counterparts in Scotland, want to break away from the United Kingdom. And Adam Price, Plaid's leader, said in the Senedd that the decision in the Supreme Court shows that far from being a union of equals, the UK is a constitution where Westminster has a veto on other nations.
We as a nation, Scotland as a nation, are not in a union of equals. We are not an equal parliament either. And unfortunately, of course, this situation will not change even with a change in government at Westminster, because the UK Labour leader has himself said that he will not agree an order in Council under Section 30 in the case of Scotland to hold an independence referendum either.
Now, you know that the position of the Welsh Government is that Wales' interests are best served by being part of the United Kingdom, but a United Kingdom that needs significant and radical reform, and those reforms are setting out in the Reforming the Union paper. I certainly am of the view that the best way of actually achieving constitutional reform and change is best achieved by electing a Labour government across the UK in the next general election.
Now, Mick Anthony have said that there needed to be radical changes to the UK. Broadly speaking, what they have in mind is more powers for this Parliament, changes to the way that the Parliaments relate to each other. Those are the kind of things that Welsh Labour want to see delivered by Keir Starmer if he becomes Prime Minister. Worth pointing out, though, that although Mark Drakeford and Keir Starmer, neither of them want to see Scotland leave the UK, there is a difference of opinion between them, because Mark Drakeford has said that he thinks the SNP does have a political mandate for that second referendum on Scottish independence.
Oh, interesting. Daniel Davis there at the Senate. Thank you very much. Sean, we've got time for one more story from this week. It was announced earlier that veterans who took part in the UK's nuclear testing programme will receive a new medal. What's the story about?
Yes, this announcement was made by the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, at the start of the week. In the late 1950s, 22,000 servicemen were sent to the South Pacific, and when they were there, they were observing atomic and hydrogen bomb explosions. For years, they have campaigned for recognition, and there's been campaigns as well because they want better health treatment, and there have been calls as well for compensation. Well, this week they got the medal, which was something they had been campaigning for quite a long time. You might have seen in earlier weeks MPs wearing this very big yellow and black badge on their lapels, which was the missing medal that the nuclear test veterans felt that they were long overdue. So this week we had the Prime Minister making the announcement, and that was followed by an announcement in the Commons as well.
Primarily, I want to record from this dispatch box the government's thanks to our veterans of our nuclear tests. From one veterans campaigner to another, I salute you. I salute your relentlessness, I salute your courage, and I salute your determination. Your legacy is long and impressive. And of course, I would like to pay tribute to the families, friends, and supporters from all sides of nuclear test veterans over the last 70 years.
Our country owes the nuclear test veterans from across the UK and the Commonwealth a debt of gratitude. Their service far away from home ensured the UK had a nuclear deterrent as part of our security and safety. They made this commitment to our country at great personal cost. Reports state that nuclear test veterans have a legacy of cancers, blood disorders and rare disease, while their wives report 3 times the usual rate of miscarriage. Their children also have 10 times the normal amount of birth defects and are 5 times more likely to die as infants. This was the cost of our nation's safety.
Whilst I welcome this decision, we have to, as the Minister himself acknowledges, we have to recognise that there is much more work to be done to recognise the extent of nuclear test veterans' suffering. In the US, in Canada and in France, the test veterans have been compensated. So will the Ministry of Defence now consider a financial package of compensation for nuclear test veterans who have suffered poor health consequences as a result of their exposure to ionising radiation?
When it comes to compensation, look, those who there are war pensions available, and indeed nuclear test veterans do claim war pensions from the Ministry of Defence. At the moment, when I was there in 2019, we created a sort of a clearer care pathway for individuals to come forward and make those claims, but I totally accept there's more to do. Other countries do it differently, you know, we're always open as the science becomes clearer. We're always open to making sure that we look after these people.
That's it from Johnny Mercer there in the Chamber for the Government. Thank you to you, Sean, for joining me. And that's all for Politics UK. I'll be back with you on BBC Two at 12:45, slightly later time on Monday, with more Politics Live.